everybody remember your program from this national and the show directory? On the cover is an Interurban drawn by Robert Winkler, longtime insulator collector from Michigan City, Indiana, sitting in the front row with the white hat on. He is our resident interurban expert, so if I get something wrong, he's going to correct me, right? You guys remember Old Crown Jewels back in the 70s and early 80s, covers, hand-drawn? That was him. All right, I have a nice cover here with some photos of insulators. I stole all these photos. These are from Icon, NIA, a couple insulator posts from for sale pages on Icon. So I thank all those people who I stole the photos from. What is an interurban? I'm not going to read all this. You guys can read this later. This is just a PowerPoint outline, but I kind of highlighted the red text here. A well-developed commuter rail service and an interurban are not really distinguishable. However, an interurban is always electrified, and that is what we're interested in because we collect insulators. Interurbans tended to share tracks with streetcar systems. Oops, let me go back a page. Interurbans had much closer stop spacing. You had to stop every so many, a short amount of time because you're going town to town rather than from city to city. And then lastly, interurbans were primarily intended for passenger service. They didn't really mix freight on them. As the interurbans started to go by their wayside, some did include some freight, shipping milk and other things to the bigger city markets to be sold in their markets. Let's talk about how this developed. First, well, I'm not going to call it an interurban because it's not electrified, but the first type of passenger service here is a horse-drawn trolley. You'll notice the wheels are on steel rails. That's not wood wheels. That is a steel rail with the horses pulling the trolley. You have steam passenger service. That's your long distance, not your interurban, because again, city to city, long spans between stops. Reason why? Steam trains don't stop and start quickly. The interurban was what was developed to go from 0 to 60 in 60 seconds or whatever. Let's continue that. Cable cars. Classic San Francisco cable car. What propels that is cables under the road pulling the trolleys uphill, downhill, braking, what have you. But they needed motors to run the cables, so hence they needed power to run the cables. Typical Chicago, third rail electric. That's a shot in the loop. That was developed in Boston, suburban Chicago, all over the country. Yeah, Bill, that was Boston I was talking about. Here locally, we also had what is a catenary service, which is overhead wires. Instead of getting the third rail power, they got the electric to the top of the cars. They had overhead, what they call catenaries, with wires and a pantograph that the car would pick up the power from that overhead wire from. We talk about some research sources. You got Google Books, which has a lot of these trade journals: Street Railway Journal, Street Railway Review, Electric Railway Journal, Electric Railway Review, plus your general electrical trade journals: Western Electrician, Electrical Engineer, Journal of Electricity, Power and Gas. I could go on and on. Then you got newspaper articles, maps, and there's railfan websites out there too. And lastly, the Insulator Gazette. Throughout the rest of this slideshow, I'll have links to where we have done, Elton, myself, and other people have typed and scanned the photos from these trade journals that all this slideshow is based on. Where were these not trolley lines, but interurbans? Here's a typical map of the Midwest centered on Indiana, where we are. The northern part of Indiana, to the lower right of the lake, that's where we are. On the left side is Chicago. The middle of the state where you kind of see the lines rating out, Indianapolis. Detroit's in the far upper right corner. Toledo, Cleveland's kind of cut off here. But you can see the density of these rail lines that were there. Take a look what you can do back in 1902. You can go from Muskegon, Michigan to Boston up to Portland, Maine, down and then down the Atlantic seaboard. This is a composite map that I spliced together of how you can do that. This was from a particular trade journal. So what is the difference between a third rail and a catenary? Kind of touched on it before. Third rail, the railroad cars pick up power from an electrified rail, obviously on the ground, so it is a third rail, two rails for the car to ride on. Third rail picks up brushes on the car, powers motors on the cars. Catenary, that again touched on it before, overhead wires. The top of the car has a pantograph that they call it that picks up the power from the overhead power lines. Transmission lines, feeders, communication lines. Basically, you had power for whether it's catenary or third rail, high voltage power that had to be fed to substations. Then those substations had feeder lines that fed either the third rail or the catenary system. And then you had a communication line so that they could either phone or telegraph, probably phone at this point. You're talking about speed of getting an answer to the next station, trouble calls, all that. A lot of times, all three of these items were on the same pole. So there was spacing issues so that your telephone line wouldn't get energized from the feeder. Feeder was far enough away from the transmission line. Some of the transmission lines would go across country because they had to get substation to substation along the line, but the shortest distance might not always be along the track. So you have kind of two different things to look for there. Let's talk about the earliest one. Everybody know the Fisher Insulator? Yeah, Colin, I know you know. You live there. So San Jose and Detroit both were the very earliest installations, but those links take you directly to the articles that we reference. Another early one, Norwich, Taft-filled to Baltic, uses the U701 GE porcelains on its transmission line.
What state is that?
Connecticut? Yeah. This image came from the trade journal that's referenced here above. Elton, is that like one of the very earliest porcelains? Yep. This next one's interesting. We're going to go to Chicago. City of Chicago, Chicago City Railway Company, 1895. We have the introduction of CD 308. That's not a Hemingway piece. That's most likely, in my opinion, a Pennyquick. That's a drawing from the trade journal. This number 38 is a photograph from the trade journal article, along with the CD140 Oakman, or CD140 Jumbo. Don't know if it's an Oakman or not. But again, we're 1895, so I'm guessing it's maybe Brookfield or something of that nature. The article also showed 257 Mickeys, 263 Columbias, and the Ear Jumbo 269, as well as the U934 Imperials. There's your 934 Imperial. This is a drawing from the article that also showed a composite insulator. I believe this is about as close of a match as I could get to what was in the article. And there's your Ear Jumbo. The Chicago elevated lines, 1898. There's your CD 257s on the cross rails between the tracks on the elevated railroad. So those are all big DC cables that fed the third rails, but 15 feet up in the air. Boston Elevated Railway, 1901. Here's the tracks, similar to Chicago. They have cross ties in between the two sets of tracks. Ear jumbos running for miles. Based on findings of other people from these lines, they also used the CD-140 jumbo, and then the 267 and 267.5 NEGMs, which you can see in some of these photos here at the main station where they were found. The top horizontal cross arm there shows mostly CD-140s. Back to the Midwest. Do I have my Northern Michigan guys here? Or Southern Michigan for that matter? I know I've seen a bunch of them at the show. Detroit United Railway, as well as the Grand Rapids, Holland, and Lake Michigan Railway is 1902. CD-282 Hemingway Provost. There's a picture of the line. Catenary service. Boston and Worcester shows from 1902 the image on the left. It talks about in the article Insulator JG, which dimensions from the 1907 Knowles catalog indicate to me it's CD321, not what you see in the photos, not what you see in the drawings, but the taller version of that. Yes?
Some of these lines, actually probably the majority of the interurban lines, had what they call direct suspension trolley. It was just a single trolley. And in the catenary, you could either have simple, which was two-wire, a support cable and the contact, or compound, which was the support cable, a feeder secondary, then your trolley.
Robert will explain the two different kinds of wiring that they did back then. Was that significant to this insulator choice?
It could be, yes. And if you're just using direct suspension on your bracket arm, there would be no, as a rule, there'd be no pin insulator. It would just be a hanger on a wire.
Right. Back east again as well. Worcester and Southbridge, 1902 again. U-938 Imperials with the troughs in the top umbrella to direct the water away. Again, photograph from the Trade Journal. Rick and mine's favorite, Chicago, Roar, and Elgin. A lot of write-ups in the trade journals on this line. It was one of the fastest lines out there, if I'm correct. Original install were the CD300 Lock 17s, which upon the first 6 months of install all blew up. So they replaced them with M2332 Fred locks, which we will talk about for the second half of this presentation. Another one of my favorites, Pittsburgh, McKeesport, and Connellsville in Pennsylvania. If anybody go from the west, traveling I-76 heading out to National a year ago, might have seen some of these still in service in town. That's the old Provo. These were reused in town. That's not the rail line that you're looking at. That was the power line in town. I happen to have a copy of the royalty agreement signed by Vernon Converse to Hemingway, where he got a royalty for Hemingway to produce 5,000 of these for this specific line. Illinois, Bloomington, Pontiac, and Joliet Electric Railway. A couple different things there. U-432 Thomas crosstops, and then the spindle insulator. Elton, I stole this from the 1904 St. Louis photo. None found to date, right? Just shards? So that one's elusive, not found yet. Back east again, New York, New Haven, and Hartford. U-966 Thomas, Niagara style. You can see in the photo here, in the upper left corner, again from the Trade Journal article, you can clearly see the insulator in the exact shape of that one there. Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis Railway, 1907. The GE Breakaway, those are Lima pieces. And then one in Elton's display, you can see it in person. Again, I think that was used out here at the end of the catenary arm.
They're also used on the Illinois traction system.
Correct. Illinois Traction also used those. Robert's favorite, Chicago, Lakeshore, and South Bend Railway, 1907. Elton might help me, but the Little Pony, U39 or 40A, I think. The 731A, no name Akron. This multi-part insulator is not quite correct. I couldn't find an M3070. I got something close. Again, all three of those were on the original install. The 731 is sitting over on the table there. Robert tells me it was the last one removed from the line last 3 years.
Finishing up towards South Bend. And in fact, in the area where that picture that you have there, that picture was taken from what was known as the Sale Road overpass. And that pole in that picture, up until recently, was still in service.
So the pole as well as the insulator gave 115 years of service or so.
In fact, some of them are still up. Some of them have
Some of the poles are still up.
brand new brackets and everything. But
Is this the line they just double tracked?
Michigan City and in Chicago is double track.
Yeah, it didn't used to be double tracked. Based on population growth, we have that going on in Northwest Indiana, as well as a new Western Corridor line that they built on an abandoned freight line easement. They're bringing a whole new interurban line to the western Lake County, Indiana. Third rail insulators. Well, the electric rail had to be insulated. These are examples of those. Some are in the collection of Rick Solar. That one's a Trade Journal article, photo, or drawing. And I stole the one in the lower right from insulators.info. Wood and composition. I originally wasn't thinking about San Francisco, but as I said earlier, you had to have power lines to serve the powerhouses to turn the cables. So I believe the wooden insulators were used on the power lines serving the interurban powerhouses for the trolley cables. We got a few compositions here. This one in the upper right is a catenary style. You have the messenger cable up at the top, and I believe the power cable at the bottom. Some oddities. Some of you might have saw a post recently about this piece. This was used on the Syracuse, Lakeshore, and Northern, and Rochester, Syracuse, and Eastern railroads. They had a big iron truss-like structure built over the railway, and these were on top of the trusses, bolted down. That's why it's got the 4 bolt holes. That's a drawing from that Trade Journal article. Let's talk about a couple other oddities. Lansing, St. John's, and St. Louis Railway. That's Michigan. This insulator here has not been found. It is a catenary style. That's why it's got this weird bracket on top. It kind of resembles a Hemingway doorknob from the top half. However, under the shed of this skirt are ribs like you'd have on a Knowles piece. And then a threaded pinhole with this bolted connection on the bottom. Here's another weird thing. Rick actually owns 2 of these. It's a strain insulator, but it says car stop on it. According to the advertisement, it says used in New York and interurban lines. The Trade Journal article mentions another line they were also used on in Ohio in the Columbus area, which is, I suspect, where Rick got his from. Let's talk about the fruits of our research in hunting a line. Well, that's back to our favorite Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago Railway, which at some point reversed the name to be Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin. That line was converted to a rails-to-trails bike path in 1963. It was one of the nation's earliest, now known as the Illinois Prairie Path. There are 2 substations along the line that still exist, one in West Chicago, one in South Elgin area, and a couple car barns in Wheaton, which is where they kept all the rolling stock. Our local club has walked that line since the 1990s, looking for artifacts. This is a map of the line. You have downtown Chicago on the right. In the Maywood area, west of Chicago, kind of near the river here. That line went to the east and connected with the city line, the Metropolitan West, and then the Chicago Elevated. So you took travel all the way into the city, all the way out to the far western suburbs, out to Fox Valley, which is this river valley on the far left of the drawing. Went up to Elgin, down to Aurora, kind of a sideways Y, with a branch going up to Batavia. Batavia was where the powerhouse was. That line's pretty easy to spot right now because it's the Illinois Prairie Path, as I mentioned. This is their map of their line. So where did we begin looking? Well, it's a suburban area that's pretty developed. So we didn't touch anything in Cook County east. The line is all mowed. There's no brush for anything to hide. But you get into Page County where I live. I actually live in Glen Ellen. That's what I reference here in this first paragraph. Most of the line, again, is mowed, but there were a couple exceptions. Some brushy areas, so we checked out some of those. The Batavia powerhouse line, as I mentioned, sometimes the power lines went cross-country to get to the substation rather than following the line. The path of that line goes through the Fermi Lab, which is the deep underground neutrino experiment work going on right there. So that's a federal facility, acres and acres of land. There are hiking paths there, there are buffalo there. You can go and look at that stuff, but I don't suggest taking a shovel with you on federal land like that. So we don't touch that either. So here's some 1990s era hunts, things that we found in Wheaton. Fredlock pin bases, blue JD suspensions in a pond. I think they're still there. Shards of the blown up CD300 locks and shards of some of the M2332s. Third rail insulator stuff. Lots of line hardware, including those Fredlock pin bases that we talked about. Rick and I did one on our own in 2013. There's a creek bed in West Chicago that yielded several broken M2332 bases. Some, since it's a multi-part, the bottom base was intact, but the top piece with the shell and the wire groove was broken away. And then a few hundred yards north of there, that's Rick's hand. Do you still have that same watch? You don't even have a watch anymore. We spot this up on the embankment. It is not broken, it's a whole one. First whole one we found. Rick is a very happy camper in this photo. 2014, Rick and I go to Glen Ellen, where I live. There's one short segment of line that this line partly followed a freight line. And there's a spot in Glen Ellen where it veers away and goes to this deep cut, which was a lot of gravel and boulders, like almost like moraine type soils. I said, Rick, that looks like a good spot. It's fully wooded. There's no houses right up against it. So we take a look. Seems somebody's created a bunch of hiking paths to make it easy for us to look. That is looking uphill. It might be a little deceiving, but it's quite steep. If you look at the far right photo, that's Rick down at the bottom. I'm up at the top. So that you can kind of get an idea how deep that cut was. I was in better shape then too, but pole stumps everywhere. Even this big piece of steel that would splice a pole together. Where are the insulators? Guess what? The Sierra Club takes care of those paths, and they periodically clean out garbage. And we met up with them when we were there on a chance that we happened to be there the same day they were, and the guy told us that, oh yeah, we had insulator shards and we threw them all away, right? Yeah. So that one didn't pan out. Back west again. This one is March of 21. We're in COVID. Substation 6. Just Rick and I again. I stumbled onto a YouTube video showing the inside of the substation's attic. I proceeded to call Rick and said, we have a task to do. That building is operated by a local toy train club. So the whole first floor is a layout of model trains. I got a hold of them and I arranged a visit to the attic. While we're in the first floor display room, these are on display. This Imperial, this glass bushing, this wood third rail, and this composite third rail insulator. Interesting. There's me in the basement looking at a bunch of porcelain wall tubes. I was hoping to find an Imperial or Fred Lock marked such thing. We also found these broken white Imperials in the basement. In the upper right corner, we spot this white multi-part back into a part of the building we couldn't get to. It was behind this metal pin you see in the bottom right corner. The metal pin in the bottom right corner is what held those white Imperials that didn't have the metal caps. I think they were used 746s, not 931s. This is how we got up into the attic, which was next. I brought the step ladder to this which got us to this platform. Rick brought a folding ladder that he put on the platform to get through the hatch to get up to the attic. Here's what was in the attic. These are wall-through insulators. They're still there, because we're not going to mess with that. On the right, these black painted cross arms with all the empty pins, but the insulators are still there. Here's a group of white Imperials on the right with metal caps, and then those glass bushings we saw, amongst some porcelain bushings. Sulfur cement on the white Imperials. Also wall tubes, and on the right, a piece of slate with 4 Fred Lock marked wall tubes. Needless to say, Rick and I couldn't get that down on our first trip there, so we had to go back. We also were interested in that white multi-part in the basement, but this is what we got out of the attic before we go to our next trip. There's the white Imperials. On the bottom of the right picture, you can see the sulfur cement having failed on the cap on that first Imperial, so it popped off. In the left photo, you see that same wall tube that you see in the right photo. You see some glass tubes. You see this frame with 2 of the Imperials still mounted to it, wood frame. Inside the wood frame, sitting on the concrete, is the top-shelved one M2332 Fred Lock. That was already there. That was on display in the museum. Or train club's place. So we decided we needed to call somebody that was agile to fit in that back recess to look at the multi-part in the basement, and who could help hoist the big slate panel with the Fred Lock tubes down to me on the ground. So we talked to Mike Spadafora. Mike and Rick go up in the attic again, and they lowered the slate panel down to me and one of the toy train volunteers. And then Mike spends some time in the basement trying to get the white multi-part. The basement again, here's one of the pass-throughs on the bricks about 4 courses down from the opening. You see it says ROTA. That was rotary number 2's wall portal. On the right, you see the arch ceiling. That's not arch, that's cobwebs. They used that whole shadow. That's flat ceiling, flat wall with an arch of cobwebs. So trip number 2, They found another hole 2332 Fred lock in the attic that Rick missed. It was in a 5-gallon bucket up there. There's the white multi-part. It was hot up there. It was 21, May 21. It was hot. It was a hot day. And then the full slate panel of the 4 tubes and the other slate panel, there were 2 of them, broken in half with the other 4 tubes. So we got a total of 8 Fred lock marked wall tubes, and then another big floor wall tube here. That's in addition to the one that we took down when Rick and I were there the first time. And Rick wanted one of the cross arms, so that's what's in the foreground here. There's Mike's spataphora. You see we have our masks on because it's COVID and we're outside. Mike and Rick are studying shards that Mike recovered in the basement to kitslate what he could find. On the right is one of the Fred lock tubes. You can see it marked right above the slate here in the center of the photo. Here's a close-up of the glass tubes. You might wonder what those were. Those were used in an application like the photo on the right where it was a switch. So you get marble slab, glass tubes both sides, brass running through it. And then lastly, there's the multi-part cleaned. There's the 2-part multi-part shards he found that we didn't know about. The bottom shell's complete, top shell's broken. And in the right picture, is Chris Hedges here? Does that look familiar? That was found in Chicago in the last 6 months. And Chris now owns that piece. I'm confident that piece came from these powerhouses. Does anybody have any questions about hunting lines and all that? Yes.
So in Indiana, there was, as you saw, a large network of interurban lines.
Too many lines for me to study today and present to you all. We'd be here for hours.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I just wanted to ask, have you looked at all into the line that ran from Pendleton up into Anderson, where Mountain State Park is now?
I think you're referring to the find of CD270s, 271s?
No, that was down south by like Jeffersonville.
271s that were found in Tipton, right? 270s that were found in Tipton at an auction.
Chris, those were down south by, Chris, Hedges. Those were down south by Jeffersonville, weren't they, the 270s? The 270s, those were down south in southeastern Indiana, weren't they?
Yes.
So there was a line there that had them as well?
Yeah, and that line down in southeastern Indiana had 302s.
302 Muncies, right?
They were Ohio.
Ohio?
They had the large pinhole variant, and then up around Anderson and North Anderson, I hunted a line up there and found the large pinhole 302 Muncies, not Ohio's, but Muncies, and Jade Milk 145 HG-Co beehives, and then some old telegraph stuff that really didn't have anything to do with interurban. Have you researched any of those lines at all?
If you saw those maps I showed earlier, there are so many lines. I really wanted to include the Winona line that came through Goshen up into Elkhart. I ran out of space. This is 58 slides. Yeah.
What year was the last use of the interurban?
All right, so I kind of blew over that. The South Shore line is still being used.
Only one way. It's the South Shore out here from South Bend to Chicago. Last to last.
Right, because the Chicago L now is more treated as a local line rather than a cross-country line. So yeah, one survivor. They went out of business, to finish your question, interurban lines, as you saw from the dates, their heyday was the 1890s to 1910, maybe 15, and they started to waver as the automobile became more popular and roadways were built and people could come and go more readily. These lines started to fall off. The Chicago Aurora Elgin fell off in 1957, hence why in the early 60s it became a rails to trails, because they acquired that property in that transaction.
Between 1935 and 1937, interurban industry disappeared as an industry. There were still lines, but it was no longer considered a big going concern.
So yeah, and then to further Cole's comment, there are so many lines that used the same kind of insulators, 302 Muncie's, Ohio's, Provo's, everywhere. And then all the early classic porcelain, the one on the end of the table there, Robert likes to say, because of the trade journal articles, it's a Lock 408A or B?
408B.
Yeah, 408B, M3070, or 2070.
M2470.
So, yeah, 2470.
And that is, they used to say, a number of people used to say the M2636 was the quote-unquote interurban style, but that piece right there from my research between 1905 and early 1908 beats them all out for having the right to be called interurban style, because it was almost universally installed by roads all over the Midwest.
Right. I never mentioned the 256 Manhattans. Those came out in the thousands from Chicago. U964 Fred locks, Fort Wayne. I mean, I could go on and on. And they're not all in the database yet, but we're working on it. We've got about 120 articles that are flagged as interurbans in the Insulator Gazette. So, yes.
Do we know why the CD300 locks failed? Was it mechanical, electrical failure, bad glass?
Good luck. They were, the day that they opened service in 1902 was a very, very unusually hot day. And in the afternoon, a strong thunderstorm came through. And it poured down ice cold rain. And the insulators just shattered and burned 60 holes to the ground. And 2 weeks later, an identical situation happened again, which made them decide, we got to do something in a hurry. And then they went to the porcelain, and they didn't have that trouble anymore.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think the Trade Journal talks about the part of the glass between the top of the pinhole and the wire started glowing, and they couldn't see it from the ground until the pole was already on fire. So, yeah, it punctured basically a hole in the top of the insulator.
With the Provost in Pennsylvania, do you think the electric line was the Provo line as we sort of know it today? All of those were from the Interurban line and then repurposed the couple.
That's my understanding, is those Provos were repurposed from the McKeesport line to the local utility. This is a bigger story when you talk about how all these interurbans ended up creating our electrical grid as we see it today. The conglomerates, where a lot of these lines got combined, and they had to divorce the power. I think there was a law that they divorced the power of the railroads, and the power from the interurbans couldn't be the same. So all the interurbans now were just being charged electric from this new entity. So I said it kind of created the electrical grid.
And a lot of the utilities more or less inherited the job of providing the high voltage AC for the interurbans. And one of the first things they did was upgrade those power lines. And the old insulators, well, we don't want those. But if they were still good, this is in the middle of the Depression, well, a big insulator like that is going to work fine on our distribution lines. And that is how some of this material survives to this day, because you would wonder, you go out in the country, well, what the heck is a U964 doing out here on this farm? Why, they'd come off, they'd come off an interurban line in the country territory where they industry.
Okay?
I'll tell you.
All right, I'm going to turn over the mic to Daryl then, and he can tell you exactly how to do it.
What are we going to do?